When one of Hollywood's most formidable voices walked into the Good Morning America studio, he thought he was stepping into familiar territory, a cushy morning show interview. A few softball questions, a bit of light promotion for his upcoming thriller. Samuel L. Jackson had done this dance countless times before. What he didn't expect was that he was walking straight into a firestorm masked in stage lights and coffee mugs. What unfolded that morning would go down as one of the most shocking, unscripted, and unforgettable confrontations ever broadcast live on national television. The studio buzzed with its typical early morning rhythm, crew members checking angles, camera operators steadying their shots, producers barking directions through ear. The warmth of the lights reflected off polished desks, and the air carried the familiar scent of makeup and fresh coffee. Jackson sat in the guest chair, casually adjusting his leather jacket, that iconic smirk curling his lips. This was routine, a well-worn rhythm, another hit film, another 10-minute puff piece, another headline. He nodded toward the host with casual coolness, prepared for pleasantries and movie chatter. George Stephanopoulos sat behind the desk, his fingers skimming over a stack of notes. His face, calm as always, betrayed no hint of what was coming. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. America was watching. We are back with Academy Award nominee Samuel L. Jackson. George began, his voice smooth and professional. Samuel, thank you for being here this morning. Always a pleasure. George, Jackson responded with his signature charm. Good to see you again. But almost immediately, something felt off. The tone in George's voice carried a sharpness, a subtle iciness beneath the polished professionalism. His eyes, usually placid and controlled, bore into Jackson with a focused intensity. It was a look Samuel had seen before, not in morning show hosts, but in prosecutors, interrogators, and journalists with axes to grind. He felt the shift like a change in air pressure before a storm. Now we're here to talk about your new film, George continued, eyes flicking down to his notes. But I think our viewers would be more interested in discussing some of your recent, let's say, more controversial statements about Hollywood, about certain political figures, and particularly about the media. The room seemed to exhale. All at once, even the crew members stopped what they were doing. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Controversial statements. George, I'm here to promote a movie. That's what your producers told me. But George didn't back off. In fact, he leaned in. Come on, Samuel. You know what I'm referring to. Last month you made comments criticizing the film industry's treatment of veteran actors. Took aim at network executives, and, let's not forget, accused certain media personalities of not knowing their place. That's your quote. The air snapped taut with tension. The audience watching at home likely leaned in, their morning coffee forgotten. Jackson's face remained calm, but his posture shifted slightly more alert, more controlled. He recognized this setup. This wasn't an interview. It was an ambush. I think there's a misunderstanding here, Jackson replied, his voice cool and clipped. I came here to talk about the film, not to be interrogated about quotes taken out of context. But George wasn't letting go. He saw the spark of tension and fanned it into flame. Taken out of context, these were direct quotes. You specifically called out news anchors who, in your words, push around guests because they have a platform. Were you referring to someone in particular? And there it was. The real purpose behind the smokescreen. This wasn't about film or public discourse. This was personal. Jackson leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. You know what, George? You invited me here to talk about my work. That's what I agreed to. But clearly, you had something else in mind. That's not journalism. That's entrapment. The studio's hum turned into silence. Stephanopoulos kept his composure, but something flickered in his eyes, a glint of victory. Perhaps, because he believed he had Jackson cornered. Samuel, I think our viewers deserve transparency. When a public figure makes statements that could be interpreted as threats or intimidation tactics, don't we have a duty to ask them about it? The word threats landed like a grenade. Jackson blinked, once, then twice. His voice, when it returned, was sharper than before, honed like a blade. Did you just accuse me of making threats on live television? Are you serious right now? The control room hesitated. Producers exchanged panicked glances. The floor manager took half a step forward before freezing. This was beyond damage control. This was TV history unfolding in real time. George, sensing the blood in the water, doubled down again. I'm simply asking for clarification. When you said certain personalities need to be reminded of their place, what exactly did you mean? Jackson sat perfectly still, his gaze locked in. What I meant. He began slowly, each word deliberate, is that journalism should be about facts, it should be about integrity. But more and more, it's become about sensationalism, about creating drama instead of seeking truth. That's what I was talking about. George tried to interject, but Jackson wasn't done. And if you heard that and thought it applied to you, maybe you should ask yourself why. The studio audience, silent until now, murmured softly. This was no longer entertainment. This was something else, something raw, something real. George cleared his throat, struggling to regain ground. Well, some might say that your reaction proves the point I'm trying to make about your temperament. And with that, Jackson smiled. But it wasn't warm or friendly. It was the kind of smile that preceded a famous monologue. The kind of smile that signaled someone was about to tear the room down brick by brick. My temperament, Jackson said, repeating the phrase with a kind of amused disdain. Let me explain something to you about temperament. George, I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've sat across from presidents, dictators, critics, and cowards. I've been questioned, praised, attacked, and misquoted, and never once did I lose my cool unless someone earned it. George shifted in his chair. You think sitting behind a desk gives you the right to twist someone's words, bait them into losing their temper, and then sit back and act like you're just doing your job. Stephanopoulos opened his mouth, but Jackson continued. You invited me here to talk about my work. Instead, you're trying to provoke a headline. That's not integrity. That's opportunism. The camera panned slightly, catching the crew frozen mid-motion, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let it ride. They chose the latter. You say you're asking honest questions, Jackson went on. Let me ask you something honest. What does it feel like knowing you've made a career out of ambushing people who came to your show in good faith? What does it feel like to be respected less for your questions and more for how many feathers you ruffle? George's silence was answer enough. But Jackson didn't stop. You want to talk about temperament? The only person whose temperament is in question here is yours. Because you've been playing puppet master with people's lives and reputations long enough. And now, you're staring down someone who isn't playing along. The lights seemed hotter now. The audience, both in the studio and at home, knew they were watching something that wouldn't be forgotten. No script, no spin, just a showdown. Between a man with nothing to prove and a man who just lost control of his own show. Calm down. George said, finally, it was the wrong thing to say. Jackson's voice dropped an octave, thick with disbelief. You just told me to calm down after ambushing me on live television, after twisting my words and accusing me of making threats, and you think I'm the one with a temperament problem. It was over. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Stephanopoulos, once confident and controlled, now sat pale and shrinking beneath Jackson's unrelenting glare. Jackson leaned forward again, voice low, calm, but vibrating with power. Let me be clear, George, I didn't come here to threaten anyone. But don't mistake that for weakness. I came here to share my work, but you chose disrespect over dialogue, and now you're learning what happens when you disrespect the wrong man. The studio was quiet in the way only a live studio can be when something irreversible has happened. No amount of glossy transitions or upbeat background music could smooth over what had just taken place. George Stephanopoulos sat stiffly behind the desk, blinking through the heat of the overhead lights and the weight of Samuel L. Jackson's words still vibrating in the air. He opened his mouth to respond, but whatever words he intended to offer withered before they could form. Across from him, Jackson hadn't moved. His posture was still, composed, but the atmosphere around him crackled with tension, as if the very walls of the studio were holding their breath. Finally, George tried. Again, Samuel, I think, but Jackson raised a hand, just a slight motion, but one that silenced the entire studio. You think, Jackson said, calmly but firmly, that you can spin this, that you can still control the narrative. But let me tell you something, George, there is no editing bay for live TV. This isn't post-production. This isn't a PR-friendly segment you can reframe with a chirpy tweet and some stock B-roll. This is truth, and unfortunately for you, truth doesn't always come dressed in a necktie and smile. George glanced toward the producers. But no, one moved. They were watching, just like everyone else. Not because they supported what was happening, but because they understood it was bigger than them, now too big to stop. Jackson leaned back, his voice softening in volume but not in force. You said you were trying to get clarification on my comments. But that's not what this was. This was a setup. You thought I'd squirm. You thought you'd corner me. You thought you could get a viral soundbite at my expense. You know what your mistake was, George? George didn't answer. You underestimated me. The line hung heavy in the air. Jackson stood slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled, like a man walking through fire, but never breaking his stride. He stepped away from the chair, but didn't leave. Not yet. His presence loomed larger than the set, larger than the stage, larger than the entire format of morning television. And when he spoke again, his voice carried with it the gravity of decades in the industry and a life carved out of grit, grace, and grit again. You think just because someone's in the spotlight, they don't know how to defend themselves, that they'll just smile, nod, and swallow whatever poison you spoon-feed them. Well, I'm not that guy. I don't roll over because a man in a suit with a microphone tells me to. George swallowed, his voice tight. I wasn't trying to poison anything, Jackson cut him off. No, then why did you start this segment by quoting headlines, not facts, not transcripts? Headlines. Why did you reduce a 40-year career to a 30-second controversy? Why did you think you had the right to put words in my mouth, then challenge me to explain ones I never even said in the way you presented them? There was a pause, a deep one, before Jackson continued. Because here's the thing, George, this isn't about the truth. This is about you trying to look powerful. You don't want a conversation. You want control. And you just lost it. George shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His previously firm tone had given way to a quiet desperation. This isn't the way we usually do things. That's the first true thing you've said all morning, Jackson replied. Because if this is how you normally treat your guests, then your show has a bigger problem than bad ratings. The crew, the co-hosts, even the background staff standing off camera all were still. This wasn't morning fluff. This was a reckoning. Jackson's voice dipped into that infamous cinematic whisper, again the one that always preceded the scene-stealing line. You wanted transparency? Here's some. You brought me here to break me down, but all you did was break yourself. George's face was pale now. His polished exterior had cracked. His practiced demeanor couldn't hide the fact that he had lost control of the entire segment. He tried to salvage it one last time. Maybe we should go to commercial, he said weakly, almost to himself. You can go to commercial, Jackson said, eyes narrowing. But I'm not going to let you end this without hearing one more thing. He took a step closer to the desk. People at home, people watching right now, they see what this is. They're not stupid. They can tell the difference between a real conversation and a cheap ambush. They know when someone's being genuine, and when someone's just swinging punches for views. George said nothing. And what you've shown them today, Jackson continued, is that you're more interested in being a viral clip than a credible journalist? Then, in one fluid motion, Jackson unclipped his microphone. The studio watched in stunned silence as he placed it on the desk, not flung or tossed, but with surgical precision. It was a signal, a declaration. He was done, and yet, he wasn't finished. You see, George, I've done interviews on every continent. I've been grilled by the best of them, people who came prepared, people who asked real questions, people who respected the craft of journalism. And not once have I walked away feeling like I had to defend my character instead of discuss my work. Until today, George opened his mouth, but the words stayed stuck in his throat. Jackson turned to the audience, both in the studio and at home. To those watching, I want you to know something. You deserve better than this. You deserve journalists who ask questions to understand, not to trap. You deserve conversations that uplift, inform, and challenge, not tear down, shame, and smear. Then, he turned back to George. And as for you, George, next time you invite someone to your show, make sure you're ready for the conversation. Because if you try this again with the wrong person, you might not just lose the interview, you might lose your integrity altogether. With that, he walked off the stage, leather jacket catching the studio light as the cameras followed his exit. The echo of his footsteps seemed to linger longer than it should have. And when the doors closed behind him, the silence that followed was more telling than any headline that would come later. George sat alone at the desk, his posture slumped, his expression blank. No producer dared speak. No one rushed the stage. The director didn't call cut. There was no easy out, no edit, no retake, no damage control that could undo what had just aired live across America. Eventually, the show returned from commercial, but nothing was the same. George tried to transition to the next segment, a light cooking demo with a celebrity chef, but his voice wavered, his timing was off, his rhythm was broken, and the viewers could feel it. The studio could feel it. Later that day, social media erupted. Clips flooded. YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, millions of views within hours, memes, articles, think pieces. Late-night hosts couldn't resist dissecting the moment. Public opinion leaned heavily in Jackson's favor. Even longtime media analysts called it one of the clearest examples of a guest flipping the script on a host in modern television. Stephanopoulos trended for all the wrong reasons. ABC issued a neutral statement, commending Jackson's passion and professionalism while affirming their commitment to open dialogue. But inside the network, meetings were held, reputations reevaluated. And for the first time in his career, George Stephanopoulos found himself on the receiving end of the same scrutiny he had so often dished out. Meanwhile, Jackson returned to his press tour, but things had changed. Every interview request came with a new tone, respect. No one dared spring a surprise attack. No one dared treat him as anything less than the legend he was. His film, ironically, benefited from the confrontation. It opened stronger than expected. Viewers lined up not just for the movie, but for the man who stood his ground when it mattered. And for years after, media schools would replay that interview as a case study, not in journalism, but in dignity, in standing tall, in knowing your worth. What George had tried to spin as journalism had become a national masterclass in accountability. And Samuel L. Jackson had taught it live, unfiltered, unforgettable.